On a wet Tuesday morning in March of 1983, the First Agricultural Bank of Saline County, Kansas mailed 72 foreclosure warnings before lunch. One of them went to a farmer named Walter Boone, who had been working the same 240 acres outside Gypsum since Dwight Eisenhower was president. The envelope arrived folded at the corner, damp from sleet, and Walter opened it beside a coal stove wearing the same cracked leather gloves he had worn through 4 wheat harvests. The letter claimed he owed $48,112.67 in delinquent operating loans, machinery notes, and accumulated penalties. Walter read it twice. Then he folded it once. Carefully, not angry, not frightened, just thoughtful. Outside his kitchen window sat a 1956 Farmel 400 diesel with faded red paint and rear tires so worn the lugs looked melted. Walter's father had bought that tractor new from a dealer in McPherson County for $3,900 after hauling cattle through the winter of 1955. 55 horsepower, nearly 6,000 pounds. A torque-heavy engine built before accountants started designing machinery. Walter still changed the oil every 80 hours himself. That tractor mattered because it was the last thing his father touched before dying in July of 1968, and the bank wanted it. The problem was not simple debt. America was entering the hardest years the farm economy had seen since the Great Depression. Interest rates climbed past 16%. Wheat prices dropped. Fuel rose. Banks that once begged farmers to borrow money suddenly acted like those same men were thieves. Let me tell you about Saline County during those years. Half the cafes along Interstate 70 filled every morning with men pretending they were not scared. Auction posters hung in feed stores like funeral notices. Families stopped repairing barns because nobody knew whether they would still own them by winter. The average operating loan for Kansas wheat farms had nearly doubled between 1977 and 1982, but the price of grain refused to follow. Farmers who had survived droughts, blizzards, grasshopper seasons, and machinery fires started losing land because paper changed faster than weather. Walter Boone understood all of that. But he also understood paperwork. Nobody at First Agricultural Bank knew that, especially not Curtis Vail. Curtis was 34 years old, clean-shaven, sharply dressed, and recently promoted from Wichita. He believed in expansion, modern financing, leveraged growth, and computerized projections. He drove a cream-colored Cadillac, Seville with polished chrome wheels that looked absurd parked beside grain trucks. Curtis thought old farmers were emotional men trapped in old habits. Walter thought Curtis had never repaired a machine by lantern light. 3 days after foreclosure notice arrived, Walter walked into bank carrying a plain manila envelope. Mud clung to his boots. His denim coat smelled faintly of diesel fuel and cold wind. The lobby became quiet. Walter handed the envelope to Curtis. "This clears the debt," he said. Curtis opened it. Inside sat a handwritten letter, copies of grain receipts dating back 8 years, canceled checks, tax filings, and one folded carbon paper contract from September 1978. Curtis read for nearly a minute. Then he laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, sharp enough to turn heads. 2 tellers looked down immediately. A rancher waiting near the counter shifted uncomfortably. Curtis leaned back in his chair and laughed again. "You're trying to pay $48,000 with bookkeeping?" he asked. Walter nodded once. "Not bookkeeping," he said quietly. "Proof." Curtis unfolded the old contract again. It concerned a grain storage agreement signed during the autumn wheat rush of 1978. According to Walter's records, the bank had illegally reassigned revenue from stored grain shipments without properly crediting his machinery note. Interest had continued accumulating against money already paid. Curtis smiled like a teacher humoring a child. "Mr. Boone," he said, "this isn't how the real world works anymore." Several people heard him. Walter never raised his voice. He simply removed his gloves finger by finger. "You might want to read the state filing stamp on page 4, he said. Curtis looked. His smile faded slightly. The filing carried a notarized county seal. Still, he laughed again. Then he stamped denied across the front page so hard the ink bled through 3 sheets. "You have 30 days, Curtis said. Walter gathered the papers slowly. No shaking hands. No anger. Only patience. As he turned to leave, one of the tellers noticed something unusual. Walter Boone was smiling. That afternoon, he drove home in a rusted 1971 Chevrolet C20 pickup, fed his cattle, changed the hydraulic filter on the Farmel, and sat down at his kitchen table beneath a yellow light bulb. Then he wrote a second letter. This one was addressed to District Judge Raymond Kessler in Salina, and attached to it was a document Curtis Vale had failed to notice. The document was older than Curtis Vale's banking career, older than some of the bank tellers, older even than the office building itself. It was a grain reserve settlement affidavit filed in October 1979 under Kansas agricultural lien statutes, stamped by the county clerk and witnessed by two elevator operators who were both dead by 1983. Walter had kept it sealed inside a tobacco tin wrapped in wax paper for nearly 4 years. He understood exactly what it meant. The bank did not. Have you ever known you were right when everyone in the room said you were wrong? That feeling sat beside Walter Boone every mile during the 40-minute drive into Salina the next morning. Rain slapped against the windshield of his truck, while the heater rattled weakly through the dashboard. Beside him lay the envelope containing receipts, affidavits, payment ledgers, and grain delivery confirmations from 3 counties. Walter had organized every document by hand. Date, weight, interest calculation, transfer amount, nothing missing. Let me tell you about the way men like Walter kept records. Farmers from his generation treated paperwork the same way mechanics treated bolts inside an engine. Every washer mattered. Every missing figure eventually caused damage somewhere else. Walter used a green ledger book bought from a feed supply store in 1969 for $2.15. He recorded rainfall, diesel purchases, wheat yield per acre, veterinary costs, barren replacements, seed prices, and labor hours in handwriting so clean it resembled drafting notes. That habit came from his father, and his father learned it during the Dust Bowl. Judge Raymond Kessler listened for nearly an hour without interruption. Kessler was 62 years old, broad-shouldered, and known throughout Saline County for hating lazy legal work. Before becoming a judge, he had spent summers hauling hay near Abilene. He knew exactly how grain contracts operated. Walter laid the papers across the desk carefully. No drama, no speeches, just facts. The money was paid, Walter said. Judge Kessler adjusted his glasses. Then why hasn't the note cleared? Walter slid forward a payment transfer sheet. Because they reassigned the reserve credits after the refinancing adjustment in 1980, he replied. The judge looked up slowly. That sentence mattered, because if Walter was correct, the bank had continued collecting interest against debt already satisfied through grain collateral transfers. Not accidentally, systematically. By afternoon, Judge Kessler ordered a temporary injunction preventing foreclosure until the records could be audited. Curtis Vale received a notice during lunch. He was furious, mostly because he still believed Walter Boone was bluffing. 2 days later, Curtis arrived at Walter's farm with an auditor, a deputy clerk, and enough confidence to fill the entire county road. The sky hung low and gray above the wheat fields. Wind pushed dry stalks against the fence lines. Walter stood beside the Farmel 400 tightening a fuel line with an open-end wrench when the Cadillac rolled into the yard. Curtis stepped out smiling. You really dragged the district judge into this, he said. Walter wiped his hands on a rag. You dragged him in, he answered. The auditor spent 6 hours inside Walter's kitchen. Boxes opened, ledgers examined, receipts matched, dates checked. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. Because Walter had not merely tracked payments. He had tracked timing, and timing was everything. The bank had delayed applying reserve grain profits during a refinancing window when interest rates spiked above 17%. That delay alone added nearly $11,000 in accumulated charges over 3 years. The auditor stopped writing twice just to stare at the numbers. Curtis began sweating through his collar. Around sunset, they stepped outside while Walter refilled a Farmel with diesel from a hand pump barrel. Curtis looked at the tractor dismissively. That thing belongs in a museum, he muttered. Walter rested one hand on the hood. Still works, he said. Let me tell you about the Farmel 400. International Harvester built the diesel version between 1954 and 1956 with a four-cylinder engine capable of extraordinary low-end pulling power. Farmers trusted those tractors because the engines ran slow and heavy, thick castings, massive crankshafts, simpler hydraulics. Modern tractors often produce more horsepower, but many older farmers will tell you torque matters more than speed. When ground gets difficult, horsepower measures how fast work happens. Torque measures the force that keeps happening after conditions turn ugly. That is why an old tractor with lower horsepower can still outpull newer machines in wet soil or steep fields. Walter understood that principle about machines and about people. The audit continued 3 more days. Then the results reached Judge Kessler. By Friday morning, First Agricultural Bank faced possible sanctions, fraudulent collection findings, and civil liability exceeding $200,000. News spread fast. Too fast. Farmers began gathering outside the courthouse. Reporters arrived from Wichita. And Curtis Vale realized something terrible. Walter Boone had never once threatened the bank. He had simply handed them the truth and waited. Then Judge Kessler scheduled a public hearing. What Curtis heard inside that courtroom changed the rest of his life. The courtroom in Saline filled before sunrise on April 14, 1983. Farmers still on the walls wearing seed caps, work jackets, and boots still dusted with feedlot mud. A radio reporter from Wichita balanced a tape recorder on his knee. 3 bank representatives sat rigidly beside Curtis Vale, whose confidence had finally begun collapsing under the weight of his own signatures. Walter Boone entered quietly. No grand entrance. No lawyer parade. Just a 72-year-old farmer carrying a cardboard document box tied with baling twine. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Not fashionable, not efficient, not modern, yet somehow dependable in ways newer things could never quite become? That was Walter. That was the farmer. And that was every yellowed ledger page inside the box he placed before Judge Raymond Kessler. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Bank attorneys argued clerical ambiguity. Walter answered with dates. They argued interpretation. Walter answered with receipts. They argued refinancing complexity. Walter answered with signatures. The room slowly changed sides. Around noon, Judge Kessler asked Curtis Vale a direct question. Did you personally review the original reserve transfer filings before denying Mr. Boone's clearance request? Curtis hesitated. That pause lasted barely 3 seconds. But everyone felt it. No, he admitted. The courtroom became silent. Judge Kessler leaned back heavily. Then Walter did something unexpected. He defended Curtis. Not completely, but enough. He didn't create the system, Walter said calmly. He just trusted it more than he trusted people. Several farmers exchanged looks. Curtis stared at Walter in disbelief. Let me tell you about pride in rural America. City people often mistake quiet men for simple men. They think politeness means weakness. But farmers from Walter's generation understood something different. If a combine breaks during harvest, yelling does not fix the machine. If cattle get through a fence at midnight in January, anger does not close the gate. Pride without patience becomes useless very quickly on a farm. Walter had learned that lesson over 50 harvest seasons. The bank's final mistake arrived shortly after lunch. An internal memo surfaced, dated December 11, 1980. Signed by a regional supervisor. The memo advised delaying certain reserve credit applications during refinancing reviews to maximize recovery positioning. Judge Kessler read the sentence twice. Then once more. Curtis Vale looked physically ill, because now he understood. Walter had been telling the truth from the beginning. The ruling came at 4:17 that afternoon. Judge Kessler dismissed the foreclosure action immediately. He ordered the debt cleared. All accumulated penalties removed, improper interest returned, legal fees reimbursed, and he issued formal findings criticizing the bank's handling of agricultural loan adjustments during the farm crisis. Nobody cheered at first. People just sat there, absorbing it. Then somebody near the back began clapping slowly. Others joined, not loud, respectful. the kind of applause reserved for men who endured something difficult without surrendering themselves in the process. Curtis Vale remained seated long after the room emptied. Walter walked past him carrying the document box. Curtis finally spoke. "I laughed at you," he said quietly. Walter nodded. "Yes, I was wrong." Walter rested one hand against the worn cardboard lid. "You were rushed," he answered. "That's worse." Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Walter asking questions about lawsuits, compensation, and revenge. Walter ignored most of them. One reporter asked what he planned to do next. Walter thought briefly. "Plant wheat," he said. That evening he drove home beneath a dark Kansas sky streaked with distant lightning. The Farmel 400 waited exactly where he had left it beside the machine shed. Walter climbed onto the steel seat, pressed a starter, and the old diesel engine rolled alive through a cloud of gray smoke. Slow, heavy, steady, the sound echoed across the fields. Curtis Vale arrived 20 minutes later. Alone, no Cadillac smile now, no polished confidence. He stood beside the tractor while Walter let the engine idle. "I came to apologize properly," Curtis said. Walter shut the tractor down. Silence settled over the farmyard. "You know why that machine still runs?" Walter asked. Curtis shook his head. "Because every winter I take it apart before something breaks," Walter said. "Most people wait for smoke." Curtis looked toward the fields. The wind moved through the wheat in slow waves. "I thought efficiency meant speed," he admitted. Walter smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Efficiency means surviving." They stood there together beside the Farmel, while evening settled over Saline County. Then Walter handed Curtis the original debt clearance letter, the same one Curtis had stamped denied. Across the bottom, Walter had written something in blue ink after leaving the bank weeks earlier. "Someday you'll learn the difference between numbers and value." Curtis read the sentence twice, and for the first time since arriving in Kansas, he understood exactly where he was. The next morning, First Agricultural Bank received another letter from Judge Raymond Kessler. This one threatened a wider state investigation, and buried inside the final paragraph was a name nobody expected to see: Walter Boone. The investigation spread across central Kansas through the summer of 1983. State auditors reviewed hundreds of agricultural refinancing files from the hardest years of the farm crisis. Several foreclosure actions were paused. Interest calculations were re-examined. Reserve credit practices changed, quietly at first, then publicly. And oddly enough, one of the people helping farmers understand the paperwork was Curtis Vale. 5 years earlier, he would have called that impossible. But losing publicly has a way of stripping useless things from a man. Curtis stayed in Saline County after the hearing, instead of returning to Wichita. He stopped selling aggressive refinancing packages. He started visiting farms personally before approving machinery notes. Sometimes he sat at kitchen tables for hours just listening. Walter never mentioned the courtroom again. Not once. That was not his way. Let me tell you about the years after the ruling. Wheat prices remained difficult. Rainfall stayed unpredictable. More farms disappeared during the middle years of the 1980s than most Americans realize. But Walter Boone survived because his operation stayed small enough to manage and strong enough to endure bad seasons. He planted hard red winter wheat across 140 acres, rotated milo on the western fields, and refused to finance machinery he could repair himself. The Farmel 400 remained the center of everything. Walter rebuilt the injector pump in 1986 beside a potbelly stove during a January blizzard. He replaced the clutch plate in 1989 with help from his daughter Lane, who learned to drive the tractor at age 12 sitting on her grandfather's lap. By 1991, the hour meter no longer worked, but neighbors estimated the machine had logged well over 19,000 hours. And still it started, even in winter. Even after sitting. Curtis visited often, sometimes officially, sometimes not. One autumn evening in 1990, he admitted something while helping Walter grease the tractor's front axle. "When I laughed at you," Curtis said, "I thought you were fighting to save old equipment." Walter tightened the grease cap slowly. "I was," he answered. Curtis frowned. Walter rested his hand against the hood. But not just this equipment. That sentence stayed with Curtis for years. Have you ever watched someone protect something so carefully that you finally realized it was carrying memories? Not just weight, that was a farmal. Not steel, not diesel. Memory. Walter Boone died peacefully in February of 1994 after feeding cattle during a snowstorm outside Gypsum. He was 83 years old. Elaine found him seated in a chair beside the kitchen window, facing the fields he had farmed for nearly half a century. The funeral drew bankers, mechanics, wheat farmers, elevator workers, and county officials from 3 counties. Curtis Vail spoke quietly near the end. He taught me that records matter because people matter, he said. After the service, Elaine drove the Farmal 400 slowly past the cemetery. The engine still carried that same deep diesel rhythm. Heavy, certain, unhurried. She kept farming the Boone land with her husband through the late 1990s. The Farmal handled lighter jobs by then: auger duty, fence pulling, hay wagons, winter feeding. Modern tractors managed the heavier tillage work, but nobody considered selling the old machine, not even once. In 2003, Curtis retired from banking entirely. Instead of moving away, he began volunteering with Kansas farm mediation programs, helping families understand agricultural loan structures before signing anything dangerous. People trusted him because he admitted his mistakes openly. That mattered, especially in farm country. One spring afternoon in 2008, Curtis visited Elaine Boone during wheat planting. He found the Farmal parked beside a newer John Deere tractor, worth nearly $90,000. Curtis smiled. "You still keep the old one around," he said. Elaine laughed softly. "Dad said every farm needs one machine that remembers everybody who touched it." Curtis ran his hand along the faded red paint. Years earlier, he would have seen only outdated machinery. Now he saw discipline, patience, continuity, a way of living that measured value differently than banks did. The tractor started immediately that afternoon. It always did, even after 52 years, even after lawsuits, even after funerals. Some things don't survive because they are newer. They survive because someone cared for them long enough to understand what they were truly carrying. If you knew someone like Walter Boone, someone who stayed calm while everybody else laughed, someone who kept careful records, repaired old machines, and protected things other people called obsolete, tell me about them in the comments. I read those stories carefully because they matter more than most people realize. And if you want to hear about the Iowa farmer who had a 1948 case LA tractor inside an abandoned limestone quarry for nearly 12 years rather than an auction company haul away, there's another story waiting down the road. You'll want to be here when we tell it.